Sometimes the softest stories are born in the quietest hours, when the world has gone still, and a voice drifts through the dark like a lantern on water.
This is one of those stories.
You are not just listening. You are part of this moment. We truly love and care for you, and it means something special that you are here, choosing calm, choosing rest. He grew up in the small moments, in the corners of rooms where no one else paid much attention. Childhood for him was never loud, never full of flashing lights or the clamor of busy crowds. Instead, it was woven out of softer threads, sunlight settling across the kitchen floor, the rhythm of rain against the windows, the gentle patience of a hand resting on his shoulder when words would not come. He learned, little by little, that life spoke to him most clearly not in shouts but in whispers. There was always a strangeness about him, though no one called it strange aloud. He saw things that others simply overlooked. When the wind bent the branches outside, he noticed the way their shadows seemed to dance like gentle hands across the walls. When someone smiled, he noticed not just the curve of lips, but the tiredness that softened at the edges of their eyes. It was not that he tried harder than anyone else, it was simply the way he was made. Those around him came to expect his quiet observations. He was the one who noticed when a friend lingered in sadness. He was the one who sat patiently beside a classmate who had nothing to say, offering silence as though it were a gift. Some called him thoughtful. Others called him dreamy. He never minded either way. To him, it was not a matter of choice. His heart was tuned to a slower rhythm, a quieter frequency, one that hummed underneath the noise of ordinary days. There was someone who understood him better than most. She was older, though not by much, with the same gentle way of moving through the world. She did not push him to explain himself, did not insist on drawing out answers he did not yet know how to give. Instead, she shared small moments with him, an apple sliced in half and passed wordlessly, a hum of a tune as they walked side by side, a glance that said, "I see you, even if no one else quite does." He never asked her to be his friend. She simply was. One evening, as the sun slipped low, painting the sky with pale pinks and gold, she sat with him on the porch steps. They watched the quiet street, empty except for the occasional rustle of leaves. She began to speak, not loudly, but in the low, steady voice that felt like a song one could fall asleep to. "Do you ever feel like you belong to something you can't quite name?" she asked. He turned the thought over in his mind, like a stone smoothed by years of tides. "Yes," he answered at last. "Like there's a story I'm supposed to know, but no one has told me the beginning." She smiled, and the smile was not one of amusement but of recognition. "Maybe the beginning is still coming," she said softly. That night, he dreamed again. The dream was different than others. He stood in a field that stretched farther than sight, the grass whispering like voices carried on wind. A figure appeared at the far end, blurred by distance, too far to see clearly, but close enough to feel. He could not tell if it was someone he had lost or someone he had yet to meet. The feeling stayed with him after waking, lodged in his chest like a secret he wasn't ready to share. Morning came, and life returned to its ordinary rhythm, cereal in bowls, the soft shuffle of footsteps across linoleum floors, voices drifting through the house. Yet he carried the dream like a lantern inside him, glowing faintly even as the day wore on. When his friend noticed his distracted gaze, she did not press him. She only leaned her shoulder against his, quiet but present, and that was enough. There were other moments of childhood too, ones that seemed small to others, but to him felt enormous. The first time he helped someone fix a broken toy, not because he knew how, but because he listened to what they needed. The first time he held out his hand to stop a quarrel, not with force, but with gentleness. The first time he sang a lullaby he only half remembered, and realized that the sound of his own voice soothed not only the other, but himself as well. These were not grand gestures, they were quiet ones. Yet they shaped him more than anything else. Sometimes, in the evenings, he would sit by the window and listen, not to music, not to stories, but to the silence of the house. Silence was not empty to him. It was full of traces, soft breaths of people sleeping, the ticking of a clock marking time's slow passage, the faint hum of life that continued even when no one noticed. It made him feel small, yes, but not insignificant. Small the way a star is small when seen from Earth, glowing but distant, part of a vastness too great to measure. One rainy afternoon, he asked his caretaker a question. Why do people cry when they are happy? The answer was not immediate. She looked at him, thoughtful, as though turning the question in her own heart.
At last she said, because happiness reminds us of all the times we longed for it.
Sometimes joy carries sadness inside it, like rain hiding in a cloud. He considered this quietly, and though he did not fully understand, he remembered it. He remembered it when years later he felt both joy and sadness at once, when moments carried weight too heavy for one name alone. The strangeness of him continued, and with it the soft acts that set him apart. Once a small bird crashed into the window pane, lying stunned on the ground. Others stood back, uncertain what to do. But he knelt down, cradling the fragile body in his hands. He whispered, though he knew the bird could not understand his words. Slowly, after long stillness, it fluttered and rose again, disappearing into the grey sky. He said nothing about it afterward, but the image stayed with him, a quiet reminder of the way gentleness could coax life back from the edge. People sometimes misunderstood him. They mistook his silence for disinterest, his dreams for distraction. Yet he carried no resentment for their misunderstanding. He knew even then that not everyone could see the world through the same lens. That was all right. His task was not to be understood by everyone, but to remain true to the rhythm he felt inside. As the years stretched, his friend remained by his side. Together they grew through the odd, unshaped days of childhood into something more complex. Their bond deepened, not through dramatic declarations, but through ordinary loyalty. She was the one who sat with him when he had no words. He was the one who noticed when she was weary and placed a cup of water in her hands before she asked. Neither kept count of these small offerings. They were simply exchanged like breath itself. One evening, when the stars were just beginning to show, he told her about the dream of the endless field. He spoke slowly, hesitant, but she listened without interruption. When he finished, she reached over and touched his hand lightly.
And maybe the figure was your future, she said.
Or maybe it was someone who has always been with you, even if you can't see them clearly. Her words did not explain the dream, not entirely, but they wrapped around him like a blanket. He understood then that mystery was not something to be solved. It was something to be held gently, like a fragile bird, allowed to exist without breaking it open. Childhood passed in this way, not marked by great victories or sudden revelations, but by the slow accumulation of tenderness. He learned to move gently, to listen deeply, to carry the mysteries without demanding their answers. He learned that his quiet nature was not a weakness, but a gift, one that made him a sanctuary for others. And though he did not yet know where his story was leading, he felt in the soft rhythms of ordinary days the first steps of a journey already unfolding. It was not loud, it was not grand, but it was his. Not grand, but it was his. Dreams had always come to him, though he never invited them. They arrived like tides, slipping quietly onto shore, carrying fragments of images, whispers, and feelings he could not name. At first, he thought dreams were simply dreams, fleeting shapes dissolving with morning light. But as he grew older, he noticed something different. The things he dreamed began to echo in waking hours. A place glimpsed at night appeared in the corners of his day. A phrase murmured by some distant voice surfaced later in the words of a stranger. He did not tell many people about these things. When he was younger, he had tried. He had told a teacher once, describing a dream of a garden where every flower turned toward him as he walked. The teacher had smiled politely, said it was a lovely imagination, and moved on. He learned then that some truths were too soft to survive the weight of explanation. So he kept them close, like stones in his pocket, ordinary to others, but precious to him. Sometimes the dreams left him unsettled. They were not nightmares. He rarely saw monsters or fear, but they stirred questions too large for his small hands to hold. Who was the figure in the distance? Why did stars seem to sing? Why did the sound of waves sometimes feel like a voice? He would wake with these questions pressing gently against him, not harshly, but insistently, like the steady tap of rain against glass. In the waking world, life pressed on with its quiet rhythm. He helped with chores, walked familiar paths, listened to laughter and chatter. Yet even in the midst of ordinary hours, he felt the hum of something larger. The hum was not always clear, not always comforting, but it was there. Sometimes he felt it in the pit of his stomach, a weight that pulled him to pause. Sometimes he felt it in the prickle of his skin when someone nearby carried sadness they had not spoken aloud. He did not know how to describe it, but he began to realize that he carried more than his own heart inside him. On afternoons when the light slanted golden through the windows, he often sat with his friend. She had a way of listening that required no effort. He could sit in silence and still feel heard. When he finally chose to share fragments of his dreams, she never laughed or dismissed them. Instead, she would nod slowly, as though filing each word into a secret space within her. "Maybe your dreams are doors," she once suggested. "Not every door needs to be opened right away. Some are meant to stay closed until you're ready." Her words comforted him. He began to see dreams not as riddles demanding answers, but as companions traveling beside him. He learned to walk with them, even when he did not understand their purpose. There were moments when the boundary between dream and day seemed to blur. Once, while walking near the shore, he paused. The air smelled of salt and seaweed, the tide pulling at the sand with its slow breath. For an instant he saw the same figure from his dream, the distant silhouette standing where water met horizon. He blinked, and it was gone, replaced by nothing but waves. Yet his heart knew the moment was real. He carried it with him, this merging of the unseen and the seen. It did not frighten him. Instead, it filled him with a tender awe, as though the universe was gently reminding him that more existed than what eyes could capture. The whispers came too. At times they drifted into his sleep like lullabies half-remembered, soft and almost fragile. Other times they came in the hush of twilight, when the world seemed to hold its breath. The words were rarely clear, more suggestion than speech, but they carried warmth. They felt like someone trying to reach him, not to warn, not to command, but simply to remind him that he was not alone. There were evenings when he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, and wondered if he was meant to carry a secret that even he did not yet know. The thought did not weigh heavy. It settled like mist, present but not pressing. He accepted it, the way he accepted that stars existed even when hidden by clouds. His friend noticed the faraway look in his eyes. She never scolded him for drifting into silence. Instead, she sometimes placed a hand over his, grounding him back into the moment. "Don't get lost too far inside," she would whisper with a smile. "The world here needs you too." And he would smile back, grateful, though unable to explain that he did not feel lost at all. He felt suspended, balanced between two realms, belonging to both yet fully claimed by neither. One evening, his caretaker told him a story about a seed planted long ago, a seed no one remembered burying. "It grew anyway," she said, her voice quiet in the dim light. "Sometimes life carries things we don't fully understand, but they bloom when they are ready." He thought of her words often, connecting them to his dreams. Perhaps the whispers were not answers, but seeds. Perhaps one day they would bloom into clarity. Meanwhile, he continued to live within the smallness of his days. He played games, laughed at jokes, washed dishes, folded laundry. And yet within the folds of this ordinariness there was always the shimmer of something larger. He began to see that both mattered equally, the grand and the small, the mysterious and the mundane. The sandwich shared at lunch, the cloud shaped like a ship, the star that flickered just a little brighter. All these were part of the same story. As his body grew taller and his voice began to deepen, the strangeness grew with him. He did not resist it. He let it expand, quietly shaping who he was becoming. He learned to trust the tug in his heart that guided him to sit beside someone in need, or to remain silent when silence mattered more than speech. He realized that his gift was not about power or strength. It was about presence, about being there in a way that made others feel less alone. One afternoon, while resting beneath a tree, he closed his eyes and listened. The breeze moved gently, rustling leaves into soft applause. The sound wrapped around him until he could almost believe it was a song written just for him. And in that moment he felt certain that whatever mystery he carried, it was not a burden. It was a gift, one that asked only that he live it fully, step by gentle step. When he opened his eyes, the world seemed the same as before, the same sky, the same grass, the same drifting clouds. Yet he felt different inside, steadier somehow. He did not need the answers all at once. The journey itself was its own kind of truth. That night, before sleep, he whispered quietly into the dark. He did not know to whom he spoke, whether to the figure in the field, the whispers in the stars, or the memory of someone who had come before him. But he whispered anyway, I hear you.
I don't understand you yet.
But I'm listening. And in the silence that followed, he felt the softest comfort, like arms around him though no one was there, like a lullaby sung without words. He drifted into sleep with a small smile, carrying both his questions and his peace together into the dream. Companionship was never something he searched for. It seemed to arrive naturally the way dusk arrives at the close of day. His friend had become a constant presence in his life, not through grand promises or declarations, but through the simple rhythm of shared time. They walked together more often than not, sometimes speaking, sometimes not. Their bond was woven from the small threads of ordinary days, the soft exchange of a glance, the way they laughed at things no one else found funny, the ease of being near without the need to fill silence. There was a comfort in their presence that felt older than childhood, as though they had always known one another, even before they met. He could not remember a time when he had to explain himself to her. Where others looked at him with puzzled eyes, she looked with quiet recognition. When he hesitated, she waited. When he spoke too little, she heard enough. It was a bond not easily defined, but deeply felt, like the warmth of a familiar blanket pulled across cold skin. One evening, the two of them wandered into the meadow beyond the town. The sun was melting into the horizon, scattering gold across the fields. He lay back in the grass, hands behind his head, watching clouds drift lazily above. She sat beside him, plucking at blades of grass, twisting them into little knots. For a long while, neither spoke. The world around them hushed itself into twilight, the distant call of a bird, the whisper of wind, the fading hum of insect.
At last, she broke the silence.
"Do you think we'll always stay the same?" she asked, her voice soft but edged with something fragile. He thought carefully before answering. "No," he said.
I think we'll change.
"But maybe that doesn't mean we'll lose each other." She considered this, her fingers stilling in the grass.
I don't want to lose what we have, she whispered. You won't, he promised, though he knew promises could be fragile things.
Still, he believed in the truth of his words, even if the future could not be seen. He reached out, brushing her hand lightly, the gesture speaking what words could not. Their bond deepened, not because they tried to make it so, but because life kept offering them moments to share. Once during a storm, the power in the house went out. Candles were lit, shadows stretched across the walls, and the world outside roared with rain. They sat together in the flickering glow, their faces half lit, half hidden. She began humming softly, a tune neither of them knew, but both recognized in their bones. He joined in, hesitant at first, then steady, until their voices wove together. The song had no words, but it carried a weight that felt like memory. When the lights returned, they laughed, but something unspoken lingered between them, a knowing that the storm had given them a gift. There were times when she carried burdens she could not put into sentences. He saw it in the way her shoulders hunched, the way her laughter faltered, the way she stared off too long at nothing. He did not demand explanations. Instead, he sat beside her, silent but steadfast, until her breathing steadied and her eyes softened. She once told him, "You don't always understand what I mean, but you understand me." It was perhaps the greatest truth of their bond. One autumn afternoon, they discovered an abandoned swing hanging from a tree. The rope was frayed, the wooden seat weathered smooth by years of wind and rain. She insisted he push her, her laughter bubbling into the crisp air as she swung higher and higher. He watched her hair catch the sunlight, her smile breaking open like dawn. In that moment, he thought he had never seen anything more beautiful, not because of appearance, but because she seemed free, unbound, as though the sky had chosen her. When she finally slowed, breathless, she leapt off and landed beside him. "Your turn," she said. He shook his head with a shy grin, preferring to watch. She rolled her eyes but did not press. They walked home with leaves crunching beneath their feet, both carrying the sweetness of the moment without needing to say a word. Their friendship became his anchor. On days when his dreams left him unsettled, when whispers clung to him like mist, she brought him back to earth. She reminded him that while mysteries reached for the stars, life still needed to be lived here, with feet planted in the soil. And he, in turn, offered her the gentleness she sometimes forgot to give herself. It was not always easy. They quarreled at times, small misunderstandings sparked by carelessness or unspoken expectations. Once she accused him of drifting too far into his thoughts, leaving her behind. The sting of her words lingered, and for a while they walked separately, each swallowed by silence. But eventually one of them would soften, sometimes her, sometimes him, and the distance would close. They learned that their bond was not fragile, but elastic, bending without breaking. Every quarrel, every reconciliation only added to the depth of what they shared. One night, beneath a blanket of stars, he told her something he had never told anyone. He confessed his fear that the figure in his dreams might be a sign of something he could not bear, a truth too large for him. She listened quietly, her eyes reflecting the starlight. When he finished, she took his hand and said simply, "Whatever it is, you won't face it alone." Her words settled into him like roots, steady and sure. She became a mirror in which he saw not only himself but the person he might become. Through her eyes he learned that his quietness was not emptiness, but presence. Through her laughter he remembered that joy did not have to be grand to be real. Through her trust he realized that connection was not about perfection, but about showing up, again and again, even in silence. Seasons turned, carrying them forward. Winter nights huddled near the fire, spring mornings walking beneath blossoms, summer afternoons wading barefoot through creeks. Each season carved another layer into their bond, etching it deeper into the story of who he was becoming. And always, in the quiet moments, he returned to the thought that had guided him since childhood. Some mysteries were not meant to be solved. Some were meant to be lived, shared, and carried together. She was part of that mystery now, part of the dream that stretched into waking life. He did not know where the path would lead, but he knew she would be a part of it, written into his heart like a verse in a song that never ended. As night folded over them, the world softened into hush. He lay awake, thinking of her laughter, her silences, her unwavering presence. And in the stillness, he realized that this bond, this quiet companionship, was the truest beginning of love. Not the love of stories filled with thunder, but the love of whispers, of small gestures, of lives interwoven gently until separation seemed impossible. He closed his eyes, letting the thought settle into his chest. Outside, stars blinked softly as though listening too. He drifted into sleep with the surety that in all the vastness of the world, he was not alone. The presence of his mother was not something he remembered in clear images. There were no sharp memories of her voice or the way her hands moved, no recollection of exact words spoken or songs sung. Instead, she lived in him as an absence that felt strangely full, like sunlight spilling into a room from a window that no longer opened. He sensed her in fragments, an echo caught in laughter, a warmth in the air when he was very still, the soft suggestion of a voice woven into his dreams. Others spoke of her more often than he did. They told stories, sometimes in hushed tones, sometimes with affection. To them, she was someone grand, someone whose choices carried weight beyond their understanding. To him, she was a mystery whose edges he could not hold. He tried to piece together who she had been through the fragments they offered. Yet each story contradicted another. Some spoke of her kindness, others of her strength, others of decisions so heavy they seemed to bend the shape of the world. He listened, always, but in the end he preferred the quiet sense of her he carried within himself. He trusted that more than words. It was not memory, and it was not imagination. It was something else, like standing beside the ocean and knowing its vastness without needing to see every wave. At times, he longed for her guidance. There were questions that settled heavily on him in the quiet hours, questions about who he was, why he dreamed the way he did, why the whispers came at night. He wondered if she had known, if she had understood, if she had left him with more than absence. In those moments, the longing ached in him, sharp and tender. He would close his eyes and whisper into the dark, "What did you want for me?" And though no answer came, he sometimes felt a gentleness in the air, as though silence itself was speaking. He carried her absence like one carries a scar, visible only in certain lights, but always present beneath the surface. When others asked him how he felt about her, he never knew how to respond. She was both everything and nothing, both love and enigma. She was the center of a story he had inherited without choosing, and he both yearned to understand and feared what understanding might bring. His friend noticed the weight of it. She never asked questions he did not want to answer, but she stayed close on nights when his thoughts were too heavy. Once, when he confessed his fear that he might never know who his mother truly was, she placed her hand on his arm and said, "Sometimes knowing isn't what matters. Sometimes it's enough to feel that love existed, even if the shape of it is unclear." Her words soothed him, though the ache never fully disappeared. In dreams, his mother appeared more vividly, not in form, not in face, but in presence. He dreamed of roses blooming out of stone, their petals soft but their roots tangled deep beneath the earth. He dreamed of light breaking through cracks in walls, flooding rooms that had been dark for years. In these visions he felt her near, not as someone to be seen, but as someone who had left her touch imprinted on the fabric of things. He would wake with the scent of blossoms lingering in his mind, unsure if it was real or imagined. There were moments when the absence felt almost unbearable. Once, during a gathering, he overheard others speaking about her in tones of reverence and sorrow. They spoke of sacrifices, of choices too heavy for most hearts to bear. He slipped away quietly, unable to listen, and stood outside beneath the sky. The stars looked down on him, indifferent and yet endlessly patient. He tilted his head back and whispered, "Why did you leave me with questions instead of answers?" The night offered no reply, but he felt less alone beneath its vast silence. Alone beneath its vast silence. Over time, he learned to weave her absence into his life, not as a wound, but as a thread. When he offered kindness, he wondered if it was her gift moving through him. When he felt strength rise within his chest, he thought perhaps it was her echo guiding him forward. He did not know if these feelings were truth or invention, but they gave him comfort, and sometimes comfort mattered more than certainty. His caretaker told him once that love never truly vanishes, it changes form. Even when someone is gone, she said, their love lingers in what they've touched, in the lives they've shaped, in the way you carry them forward. He held tightly to those words. They gave him a way to imagine that his mother's love was not lost, only transformed, waiting in the spaces between heartbeats, in the hush of twilight, in the dreams that visited him still. The mystery of her life and her choices remained, and though it troubled him, he began to accept that some mysteries were not meant to be solved. They were meant to be lived with, carried like a lantern whose light was both a guide and a question. He realized that perhaps his task was not to uncover every truth about her, but to shape his own truth from what remained. His friend helped him in this. When she saw him drifting into the weight of unspoken longing, she would nudge him toward laughter, toward moments of lightness. They made sandwiches together, shared them on steps beneath the sun, and for a while the ache eased. She reminded him that life continued, that joy could grow, even in the soil of mystery. He loved her for that, though he never said it aloud. And so his mother's presence, her absence, became part of him in ways he could not fully explain. It was the soft ache that guided him toward gentleness, the longing that deepened his empathy, the unanswered questions that kept his heart open. He learned that sometimes the greatest gifts are not clarity or certainty, but the quiet resilience to love even through unknowing. At night, when the world softened into sleep, he often returned to the same ritual. He would close his eyes and imagine her voice, not in words, but in tone, warm and steady. He would let himself believe, if only for a moment, that she was near, watching, proud. It did not matter if it was real. What mattered was the way it filled his heart with peace, enough to drift into dreams where roses bloomed again, carrying whispers he could not fully hear, but always felt. In this way, she lived on inside him, not as memory, not as legend, but as mystery tender enough to guide him forward. He did not need to name it. He only needed to let it be. The days moved like water, flowing quietly from one into the next, and though nothing dramatic changed on the surface, he felt a slow shifting deep inside. It was not the kind of change that arrived with thunder or lightning, but the subtle turning of seasons, the kind one only noticed when looking back. He found himself lingering more often in silence, watching the way the wind carried leaves along the ground, listening to the low hum of the world when everything else was still. There was something in that silence that both unsettled and comforted him. His friend remained his anchor through these days. She carried an ease that steadied him, a laughter that arrived at just the right moments. Sometimes she teased him for the way he drifted into thought, his gaze wandering far beyond the horizon, as though chasing something he could not name. "You're always listening to something no one else can hear," she told him once, her smile warm but curious. He had no answer, only a quiet shrug, because she was right. He was listening, always listening, to the whispers that threaded through his nights and the weight of questions that followed him into the day. One evening, As twilight fell and the first stars appeared like distant lanterns, he and his friend sat on a hill overlooking the town. The air smelled faintly of earth and wood smoke, a mixture of endings and beginnings. She leaned back, folding her hands behind her head, and spoke about her dreams, the simple ones, the ones that made her eyes light up. She dreamed of adventure, of discovering places no one else had seen, of writing stories that would outlast her. He listened, his heart quiet, because he realized how different her longing was from his own. She reached outward toward possibilities while he reached inward toward mysteries. Still their paths met in the middle. She wanted to know the world. He wanted to know himself. And perhaps, he thought, those were not so different after all. The whispers returned more strongly as the nights grew colder. They were not frightening, but they carried a weight that pressed against his chest, urging him towards something unseen. Sometimes they spoke like the rustling of leaves, other times like the murmur of waves against stone. The words were never clear, slipping away the moment he tried to hold them. Yet the feeling remained, a pull, a beckoning, as though a door waited for him somewhere in the fabric of the world. He began to dream of paths.
Long, winding paths that cut through forests or stretched across fields beneath endless skies.
In those dreams he walked alone, though he always sensed eyes watching, not unkind, but patient. He would wake with the image of those paths lingering, as though they were more than dreams, as though they were invitations. He told his caretaker about it once, haltingly, unsure of how much to share. She listened with the patience she always carried, her gaze thoughtful. When he finished, she said softly, "Sometimes the things we dream are not only ours. Sometimes they are memories carried in the world, waiting for us to step into them." He wanted to ask what that meant, but the words tangled in his throat. She did not explain further, and perhaps she did not need to. His friend noticed the shift in him too. "You're restless," she said one afternoon as they sat near the river. The water moved steadily, sunlight catching on its surface in shards of gold. He dipped a stone into the water and watched the ripples move outward. "Maybe," he admitted. She studied him for a long time before saying, "Wherever you go, you don't have to go alone." Her words warmed him, yet he knew the path he sensed was not one anyone else could fully walk with him. Still, he took comfort in her promise, even if the journey remained his own. The river seemed to carry secrets that day. Its steady rhythm reminded him of the whispers in his dreams. He wondered if water remembered more than people did, if rivers carried the echoes of everything they had ever touched. Perhaps his mother's voice was somewhere in the current, mingling with the voices of countless others. The thought made him smile, faintly, even as it stirred the ache of longing once more. As days turned into weeks, he began to sense a pattern in the pull he felt. It was strongest in the quietest hours, just before dawn, when the world held its breath between night and morning. He would wake suddenly, heart quickened, and feel as though he were being called by something older than language. Sometimes he resisted, pulling the blanket closer, willing himself back to sleep. Other times he would rise and step outside, breathing in the stillness. The air was cold, but it carried a clarity that filled him with both awe and unease. On one such morning, he wandered farther than usual, following an instinct he could not explain. The sky was pale, the stars fading, and the first birds stirred in the branches above. He reached the edge of the forest and paused, listening. The whispers were faint but insistent, threading through the trees like threads of light. He did not step inside, not yet. But he knew with a certainty that rooted deep into him that the forest held something meant for him. When he returned, his friend asked where he had gone. He hesitated, then answered honestly, "I think there's something waiting for me in the woods." She tilted her head, studying him with a mixture of curiosity and concern.
Do you know what?
He shook his head. No, but I think I'll have to find out. She frowned slightly but did not argue. Instead, she only said, Then promise me you'll be careful. He nodded, though inside he wondered if carefulness was possible when stepping toward the unknown. The days that followed were filled with anticipation, though he tried to hide it. He went about his routines, shared laughter with his friend, listened to his caretaker's gentle wisdom. Yet beneath it all, the forest whispered to him, steady and unyielding. It was not a demand, but an invitation, patient and eternal. He knew he could ignore it for a while, but not forever. For a while, but not forever. He thought often of his mother during these days. Was it her voice that stirred in the whispers? Was it her hand guiding him toward paths unseen? Or was it something older, something that belonged not to her alone, but to the fabric of the world itself? He did not know, and perhaps he never would. But the questions no longer felt like burdens. They felt like lanterns lighting the road ahead, even if the light was faint. One evening, as he and his friend watched the sun set behind the hills, she asked quietly, "Are you afraid?" He considered the question for a long time before answering. "Yes, but not enough to stay still." She smiled softly, though her eyes carried worry. "Then I'll wait for you," she said, "no matter how long it takes." He looked at her then, really looked, and felt a swell of gratitude so deep it nearly broke him. He did not say the words he wanted to say, but he hoped she felt them in the way he held her gaze. Night fell, and as he lay awake, the whispers came again, stronger than ever. They did not frighten him. They called to him like a song half-remembered, like a promise unfulfilled. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, knowing that soon, very soon, he would have to step into the forest and discover what waited in the shadows and light. The mystery was no longer something to resist. It was a path opening before him, and though he did not yet know its end, he was ready to begin. The night before he finally chose to step into the forest was unlike any other. Sleep drifted in and out of reach, hovering just beyond him, as if the whispers themselves held it back. He lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to the quiet breathing of the house, the faint groan of wooden beams settling into the dark. The air felt charged, humming with something invisible, as though the world itself was waiting. When dawn finally bled across the horizon, painting the sky in muted silver, he rose. His friend stirred in the corner where she had dozed in a chair, as if she had known he might wake before her. She blinked at him, sleep-soft but alert enough to sense the decision in his movements.
"Is it today?"
she asked quietly. He paused, then nodded. No words needed to follow. She already understood. They walked together to the edge of the woods, the morning still carrying the hush of unbroken hours. The forest loomed, not menacing, but vast and solemn, its branches tangled like the memory of a dream. Birds shifted in the canopy above, their wings fluttering like fragments of sound. The path was not marked, yet he felt it pulling at him, the same way stars tug at oceans from afar. "I'll wait here," she said softly, her hand brushing against his. Her touch was both anchor and release. He wanted to hold on longer, to delay, but the pull within him was insistent. He met her gaze, searching for words that might hold the weight of his gratitude, but none came. Instead, he simply nodded. She smiled faintly, and with that, he stepped forward, leaving her figure behind at the threshold of trees. The forest greeted him with a chorus of rustling leaves and damp earth beneath his feet. The air was cooler inside, carrying scents of moss, bark, and rain long past. Every sound seemed magnified, the crackle of twigs underfoot, the distant call of a bird, the steady rhythm of his own breath. He felt watched, but not in a way that unsettled him. It was a watchfulness that felt ancient, as if the woods themselves were alive, curious about his presence. The deeper he walked, the stronger the whispers became. They swirled around him like unseen currents, brushing against his skin, sinking into his chest. Still, the words remained elusive, half-formed, dissolving when he tried to grasp them. Yet their intent was clear. They urged him onward, beckoning him toward something hidden. Hours passed, though time felt strangely distorted within the trees. Light shifted through the canopy, dappling the ground in patterns that seemed to move of their own accord. Once he thought he glimpsed a figure ahead, a flicker of pale glow between the trunks, but when he quickened his pace, there was nothing.
Only silence and the steady hum beneath it. He grew tired, but the pull kept him from turning back.
Hunger gnawed at him faintly, thirst pressed against his throat, but these were distant concerns compared to the fire within his chest. At last he reached a clearing. Sunlight spilled through the opening, bathing the ground in gold. In the center stood a single stone, weathered and cracked, its surface carved with marks too faint to decipher. He approached slowly, reverence guiding his steps. The whispers intensified, circling the stone like wind. Kneeling, he placed his hand upon its cool surface. The moment his skin touched the stone, the whispers fell silent. In their place came a single note of sound, low and resonant, vibrating through him as though the earth itself had spoken. His breath caught. He closed his eyes and let the sound move through him. It was not a word, not in the way language shaped meaning, but he understood it nonetheless. It was welcome. It was recognition. It was as if the stone itself knew him, had been waiting for him. Tears pricked at his eyes, though he did not know why. Perhaps it was relief, perhaps awe. Perhaps it was the weight of longing finally meeting a fragment of answer. He pressed his forehead to the stone, breathing deeply, letting the silence after the sound settle into him. When the whispers returned, they were different, softer, clearer, though still beyond his full grasp. They carried no urgency now, only presence, like a hand resting gently on his shoulder. He listened, heart open, though he knew he might never understand every word. As the light shifted and the clearing dimmed, he rose. The stone stood, unmoved, ancient and enduring, but something within him had changed. The mystery had not unraveled, but it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like belonging. He retraced his steps through the forest, the path somehow easier now, as though the trees themselves guided him back. By the time he emerged, dusk had begun to paint the sky in shades of violet and rose. His friend stood where he had left her, waiting, just as she had promised. When she saw him, her face lit with both relief and curiosity.
"You found something," she said, though it was not a question.
He nodded, unable to put it into words. She did not press him. Instead, she simply took his hand as they walked back together, the silence between them rich and unbroken. That night, as he lay beneath the stars, he no longer felt restless. The questions still remained, but they no longer haunted him. They felt like companions now, lanterns to carry rather than shadows to escape. He drifted into sleep easily, dreams unfurling like petals, soft and luminous. The whispers followed him there, but they no longer urged or pulled. They sang low and steady, weaving through his dreams like threads of light. He understood none of it, and yet he understood everything. The days after the forest felt quieter, though not empty. He carried something with him now, a stillness that settled deep in his chest. His friend noticed the shift, the way he no longer looked outward with the same restless hunger. Instead, he seemed to carry the forest within him, as though the stone's silent welcome had rooted itself in his soul. She watched him with gentle curiosity, never pressing for details he could not give. Her patience was a gift, one he never took for granted. They walked often together along the riverbank, their conversations stretching into comfortable silences. She would talk about the world she longed to see, distant places where oceans kissed endless horizons, while he would listen, smiling softly at the light in her voice. He did not share the same yearning, not in the same way, but he admired her dreams, the way she wrapped herself in possibility. It was then he realized something new. Her vision pulled at him, challenged him, reminded him that belonging was not the only thing a heart could seek. There was also growth, there was change, there was the courage of stepping into the unknown. One evening she stopped mid-sentence, studying him as the sky deepened into indigo.
"You're different," she said, her eyes narrowed not in judgment but in wonder.
"You carry something I don't understand. It makes me feel close to you, but also far away." He looked at her, his chest tight with words unsaid. "I feel it too," he admitted, "like we're walking side by side but on different paths." Her smile was sad, tender. Maybe that's what friendship really is.
Not being the same but choosing to walk anyway.
The truth of her words sank into him. He realized then how much he needed her, needed the sharpness of her questions, the way she never let him sink too deeply into himself. She was a mirror that did not reflect but refracted, showing him parts of himself he could not see alone, but even mirrors can wound. There were nights when they argued, though their voices never rose above the hush of the trees. She would push him, urging him to look outward, to take risks, to step beyond the familiar. He would resist, clinging to the quiet world he knew, the safety of mysteries that asked for reverence rather than action. Once beneath a pale moon she told him, "You hide behind your softness. You think it's enough to understand, but sometimes you need to move, to change." Her words cut, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He lay awake long after, turning them over, wondering if his gentleness was a gift or a shield. Could it be both? The next morning she apologized, her voice trembling.
"I shouldn't have said it that way." He shook his head. "No, you said what I needed to hear." From then on he began to test himself in small ways.
He volunteered to help strangers he once might have passed by, offered comfort not just in silence, but in action. He spoke more often, letting his thoughts stumble into the air instead of holding them back. Each step was hesitant, but each one grew steadier, and he found a strange strength blooming in him, his friend noticed. She said nothing at first, but the warmth in her eyes told him she saw the change. One afternoon, while they sat in the shadow of an old tree, she leaned closer, her voice quiet. "I used to think you were fragile," she confessed. "But now I see it. You bend, but you don't break. You carry things most people would collapse under." Her words touched him deeply, though he still struggled to believe them. Yet even doubt could not erase the comfort they gave. Their bond deepened in these days, not because it was free of tension, but because of the way they held each other through it. She was not afraid to press against his boundaries, and he was learning not to retreat into silence. There was a rhythm between them now, a dance of difference and devotion. Sometimes he wondered what bound them so tightly. They were not alike in spirit. She was fire, he was water. But perhaps it was the balance of those elements that kept them steady. Perhaps it was that she refused to let him drift too far into the mystery. While he reminded her that not all answers were found in distant lands, one night, under a sky heavy with stars, she turned to him with a sudden seriousness. "If I left one day," she asked, "would you still carry me with you?" He stared at her, startled by the question, then answered softly, "I already do." Her expression softened, her eyes glistening in the starlight. She said nothing more, only leaned her head against his shoulder. They stayed like that until sleep tugged at them both, the silence filled with more meaning than words could hold. It was during these nights that the dreams returned, sharper than before. He dreamed of her voice calling to him across a vast distance, of reaching but never quite touching, of paths that diverged beneath his feet. He would wake with his heart aching, unsure whether the dreams were warnings or simply reflections of his fears. Yet, when he saw her in the daylight, laughing at some small thing, he felt grounded again. He realized then that dreams were not always prophecies. Sometimes they were mirrors showing what the heart already carried. Still, the tension between them never fully vanished. Her desire for exploration clashed with his need for rootedness, her hunger for answers with his acceptance of mystery. There were days when they drifted apart, speaking little, only to find themselves drawn back together, unable to remain distant for long. It was not a perfect friendship, but it was real, and in its imperfection lay its strength. One evening, as the wind stirred the tall grass around them, she said, "Do you ever think about the future?"
About where you'll be?
He hesitated, then answered, "I think about where I am now. The future feels too big," she sighed, a sound tinged with both affection and frustration. "That's the difference between us."
I can't stop thinking about what's ahead, he smiled faintly. Maybe that's why we need each other.
"You pull me forward."
I hold you here. Her laughter, soft and weary, drifted into the dusk.
"Maybe you're right." The wind quieted, and for a moment they both looked up at the stars, the silence stretching warm between them. He thought then that perhaps the bond they shared was not meant to solve their differences, but to hold them, to prove that love, whether friendship or something beyond, could exist even where paths diverged. That night, as he lay awake, he felt the whispers again. But they were different. They did not speak of stones or forests. They spoke of her, of bonds that endure, of love that stretches across distance. He did not know if it was her spirit reflected in the dreamscape or simply the echo of his own heart, but the message was clear. Some connections are not broken by time or distance. They live quietly in the marrow of who we are. He smiled into the dark, letting the whispers fade into sleep. He knew now that her presence, challenging and tender, was part of his journey as much as the forest had been. Perhaps the true path was not only about stones or mysteries, but about the people who walked beside him, shaping him in ways he could never shape himself. The nights grew heavier with stars, as though the sky itself had drawn closer, pressing its weight upon the quiet earth. He found himself looking upward more often, tracing constellations with his eyes, not for their names or histories, but for the way they pulsed like watchful companions. There was comfort in their glow, and yet also a subtle unease, as if each star carried a secret meant for him alone. The whispers returned with them, stronger now, threading through his dreams with patient insistence. They no longer drifted at the edges of his awareness, but wove themselves directly into the fabric of his sleep. Some nights he dreamed of paths stretching endlessly across starlit fields, the ground beneath him humming like an instrument. Other nights he floated weightless, suspended among glowing lights that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Always there was the same feeling, that the stars themselves were trying to speak, carrying messages that belonged to him, but that he could never fully catch. He awoke each morning with fragments lingering like mist, sometimes a phrase, sometimes a note of music, sometimes only the impression of warmth or sorrow. He tried to tell his friend haltingly, but she only tilted her head, her eyes soft.
You live half in the sky, she said once, her tone gentle.
Maybe that's where you'll always belong. Her words stayed with him. Belonging had always been a question, a thread woven through his childhood, through the absence of his mother, through the strange power that marked him as different. Now the stars seemed to whisper an answer, though it was not one of clarity, but of surrender. Perhaps belonging was not about choosing one place or one person. Perhaps it was about holding many truths at once, letting them rest inside without demanding resolution. One night, unable to sleep, he wandered outside. The town was quiet, houses wrapped in their own dreams, windows glowing faintly before dimming into stillness. He walked to the edge of the hill and lay back in the grass, letting the night sky consume his vision. The stars shimmered like an ocean turned upside down. Closing his eyes, he breathed deeply, and in that breath the whispers surged. This time they were not fragmented. They came as a chorus, low, resonant, endless. He could not decipher the words, yet he understood the emotion. Tenderness, sorrow, love that stretched beyond time. It was overwhelming, like standing in the tide of something vast. Tears slid from the corners of his eyes, unbidden. He whispered into the air, "Is it you?" though he did not know if he meant his mother or the stars themselves. The chorus did not answer, at least not in the way he wanted, but the sound wrapped around him steady as a lullaby, and he felt himself slipping into sleep right there on the grass, the earth holding him as gently as a cradle. As a cradle. When he dreamed again, it was clearer than before. He stood in a place of neither earth nor sky, a space of endless light. A figure lingered at the edge, blurred, impossible to define. He reached out, but the figure receded, leaving only a voice like wind. "Not yet," it said. Then the light dimmed, and he woke with his chest aching, both heavy and full. The following day, he told his caretaker. She listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze distant. When he finished, she said, "Sometimes the sky carries the memories of those who came before us. Sometimes it carries the weight of what is yet to be.
Either way, it is not meant to be solved, only honored." Her words settled over him like a blanket.
He realized then that the whispers were not puzzles to untangle, but companions to accept. They were part of him, as much as his laughter, his doubts, his tenderness. His friend noticed the change too. "You're softer these days," she remarked one evening, as they watched the sun dissolve into dusk. "Like you're carrying something you've made peace with," he smiled faintly. "Maybe I am, but the peace was not constant. There were nights when the whispers grew so strong, he felt pulled from his bed, drawn toward the horizon as though his body might dissolve into starlight. He would pace beneath the sky, heart pounding, until exhaustion finally carried him back to sleep. His friend sometimes found him in the morning, traces of grass clinging to his clothes, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. She said nothing, only pressed a hand to his arm, grounding him in her quiet way. One evening, they climbed the hill together. The stars shone brighter than he had ever seen, the air crisp, the silence deep. She leaned back, her arms stretched behind her, and asked, "Do you ever think they're watching us?" He nodded slowly.
"I think they remember us, remember?"
"Yes. Like every kindness, every sorrow, every dream leaves an echo, and the stars keep it safe." She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable before whispering, "That's beautiful." He wanted to tell her that he sometimes felt her laughter stitched into the night sky, that perhaps even the stars carried her light. But the words felt too fragile, too heavy to release. Instead, he only lay back, their shoulders brushing, and let the silence between them say what he could not. The dreams continued, but they no longer frightened him. Instead, he began to welcome them, closing his eyes each night with a quiet invitation. "Show me what I need. Hold me where I cannot hold myself." Sometimes he saw paths of light stretching into forever. Sometimes he saw the blurred figure again, always just out of reach. Sometimes there was nothing but the warmth of being carried, as though the universe itself had cupped him gently in its hands. He told himself that he might never understand, and that this was all right. Some mysteries were not meant to be solved but lived. Some questions carried their own answers in the asking, and so as the stars wheeled above, he surrendered. He let the whispers guide him, not toward resolution, but toward trust. Each night became less about seeking and more about resting, about allowing himself to be held by the vastness that surrounded him. He realized in a quiet moment of clarity, that the stars did not demand anything of him. They did not ask for his strength or his certainty. They only asked for his presence, for him to look up, to listen, to remember. And that was enough. That night, as he drifted into sleep, he whispered into the dark,
"I am listening." And somewhere,
in the language of stars, the answer came, not in words, but in light. The days that followed moved with a gentler rhythm, as though the world itself had softened its edges. He began to notice the smallest of things, the way light pooled in corners, the way wind carried secrets between branches, the way silence often said more than words. And within that noticing, he found himself reaching outward, offering kindness, not because it was asked for, but because it seemed to rise naturally from the well of quiet inside him. He started with small gestures. A neighbor's garden, long untended, grew wild and weary, and he found himself bending down, pulling weeds, trimming edges until green life began to breathe freely again. He left no note, gave no explanation. The woman who owned the garden noticed days later, her eyes bright with unspoken gratitude, though she never discovered who had touched her soil. Another time, he saw a child crying on the steps of the old library. Kneeling beside her, he asked no questions, only offered the steady warmth of his presence. When she finally lifted her gaze, he handed her a wildflower he had plucked on the way, a fragile thing with petals like spilled sunlight. Her tears slowed, and though she said nothing, her small hands closed around the stem as though it were the very thread of safety. He did not tell his friend about every act. Some things felt too delicate to name, too easily broken by language. But she noticed changes in him all the same. The way his silences had shifted from heavy to tender, the way his steps carried a quiet purpose.
"You're becoming a part of everything," she said once, her voice hushed, as though afraid the night might overhear.
Like the town itself breathes easier when you walk through it. Her words startled him, for he had never thought himself capable of such weight. Yet, as he looked around, he began to see it, the subtle ways the air shifted after a kind gesture, the faint glow in people's eyes when he passed, the way even the shadows seemed less stern. Perhaps kindness did not need to be grand to reshape the world. Perhaps it only needed to be consistent, steady as the heartbeat of the earth. But with each kindness, the whispers grew stronger. They threaded themselves into the fabric of his deeds, echoing with approval, with sorrow, with an ache he could not name. Sometimes, after giving, he would return home exhausted, not only in body but in spirit, as though the whispers had poured through him, leaving him both emptied and filled. It was a paradox he could not untangle. One evening, as dusk spilled its gold across the horizon, his friend joined him at the hill. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the stars emerge one by one. Finally, she asked, "Do you ever wonder why you feel so pulled to give, even when no one asks?" He thought for a moment before answering. "Because the world has given me whispers and dreams and memories I don't fully understand. Maybe kindness is the only way I know to give something back." She smiled softly. "Then maybe that's your language."
Not words, not explanations, just
gestures the world can feel. Her voice lingered in his heart, steady as a compass. From then on, he did not question the impulse to give. He carried water to the old man who sat outside the tavern each day, his face lined with years of waiting. He mended a torn fence that no one else had bothered with, the wood splintering beneath his hands until it stood straight again. He left bundles of bread at doorsteps where hunger lived quietly.
None of these acts were spoken of, and none were traced back to him.
Yet he saw the ripples, subtle, tender, undeniable, and in those ripples he felt his mother's presence, faint but real. He wondered if her spirit moved through him, if the whispers were not only stars but also her hands guiding his. Sometimes, as he worked, He caught himself humming a tune he did not know, a melody that soothed him as though it had been sung to him long ago. Perhaps it had. Perhaps memory travelled not only through thought, but through song, through gestures, through kindnesses repeated across generations. Still there were nights of doubt. He would wake with the whispers pressing too loudly, with the figure in his dreams slipping further from reach. On those nights, he felt the weight of his smallness, the futility of tending gardens and mending fences when the world held greater storms. "What difference can I make?" he asked aloud once, his voice breaking into the darkness. The stars did not answer, not in words. But the next morning, when he stepped outside, a neighbor smiled at him with uncharacteristic warmth. Later, the child with the wildflower waved shyly as she passed, her small hand clutching the now dried stem. And in those simple exchanges he saw the quiet truth. The difference was not in scale but in presence. Each act was a thread, and together they wove something unseen yet lasting. His friend understood this too. One day she placed her hand over his and said, "Kindness isn't about saving the world. It's about softening it piece by piece until even the hardest places know they can heal. Hardest places know they can heal." Her words felt like a blessing. He carried them with him into the days that followed, each act of care becoming less about proving worth and more about simply existing in alignment with the whispers that guided him. And yet, beneath it all, he sensed a quiet build, as though these acts were not only kindnesses, but preparations. The whispers grew denser, their chorus layering, their tone shifting from lullabies to something more urgent. He did not know what awaited him, but he felt the world leaning closer, as though it too was listening. On the final night of that season, he walked again to the hill with his friend. The stars shimmered like an ocean alive with fire. He lay back in the grass, his hand brushing hers, and whispered, "I think something is coming." She turned her face toward him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Then we'll meet it together." And for the first time in a long while he felt no fear. Only readiness, quiet and steady, like the earth itself had lent him its strength. As the night deepened, the whispers rose, carrying him towards sleep. He did not resist. He surrendered, knowing that whatever awaited would meet him not as a stranger, but as one who had already begun weaving his place in the fabric of the world. Through stars, through dreams, through kindness that asked for nothing, but gave everything. The first night it changed. He almost thought it was his imagination. The whispers, once so soft and lulling, carried a new tone. They no longer floated like gentle currents through his dreams. Instead, they pressed closer, their edges sharper, their cadence slower, as if they were gathering themselves into something that could not be ignored. He stirred awake, the darkness heavy around him, and listened with his whole body. The sound was not frightening, but it had weight now, like a truth preparing to reveal itself. He rose and walked outside, the grass cool beneath his feet, the air carrying the scent of rain though no storm had passed. The stars above shimmered more brightly than he remembered, as if every one of them leaned in to listen. And beneath their glow, the whispers merged into a single pulsing rhythm. He could not yet hear the words, but he felt the call, a quiet summoning that stirred the marrow of his bones. In the morning, he told his friend. Her gaze lingered on him, tender and searching. "You've been waiting for this, haven't you?" she asked. He hesitated before answering, because though he had long felt it, he had not known how much it would change him to finally arrive at this threshold.
"I think so," he said.
"But I don't know what it means." She nodded slowly, as though she too had been preparing, though in silence. "Whatever it is, you won't face it alone." Her words steadied him, yet he felt the path ahead, stretching like a river into unknown country. He spent the day in quiet tasks, mending, watering, sweeping, each movement a way of grounding himself in the ordinary. But beneath it all, the call pulsed steadily, rising and falling like the tide. By evening, he could no longer deny it. He felt compelled to return to the forest, to the stone that had once spoken in sound instead of words. They walked together this time. The trees opened their arms as if expecting them, branches swaying though no wind moved. The whispers guided them inward, clearer with each step. His friend held his hand, her presence reminding him that whatever waited would be softened by companionship. When they reached the clearing, the stone stood as before, weathered and eternal, yet different somehow, its surface faintly glowing in the dim light, as though it had absorbed centuries of starlight only to release it now. He approached slowly, the whispers swelling until they filled every breath. He placed his hand upon the stone, and again silence fell, but only for a heartbeat. Then came words, not in language he had ever studied, but in meaning so clear it bypassed thought. You are not here by chance. You carry what has been carried before. You are part of what endures. His knees buckled, and he knelt before the stone. The voice was not loud, but it moved through him like a tide, carrying memory older than his own life. Images flickered behind his closed eyes, faces he had never seen, hands planting seeds, voices singing lullabies under the same stars.
A thread stretched through them all, binding him to something larger, something endless. His friend knelt beside him, her hand steady against his shoulder.
Though she did not hear the words, she felt their weight through him. "What do they ask of you?" she whispered. He shook his head, tears streaking down his cheeks.
"Not to do, just to be."
"To keep weaving what was begun long before me." And in that moment, he understood. The whispers were not a command, but a reminder. They did not demand grand actions, nor did they offer answers to every question. They called him simply to continue, to live with the same quiet tenderness, to carry memory into gestures, to pass forward what had been passed into him. The stone pulsed once more, a final echo of recognition before the light faded. The forest fell back into its natural hush, leaves whispering in a gentler way. He rose slowly, leaning into his friend's steadiness. Together they left the clearing, though he felt it would never truly leave him. The following days unfolded like threads pulled from a loom. He moved through them differently now, aware of the lineage of kindness behind every act. When he placed water by the tavern steps, he felt the memory of others who had carried pitchers through deserts. When he hummed his mother's forgotten melody, he felt the voices of countless lullabies rising beside his own. Even the smallest smile he offered seemed to ripple outward in ways he could not see but trusted. And the whispers did not vanish. They no longer pressed with urgency but walked beside him, a constant presence. Sometimes they spoke in words, sometimes only in tones, but always they reminded him, "You are part of the long song. Keep singing." There were nights he doubted again, nights when the weight of loneliness returned, and the absence of his mother ached too deeply. On those nights his friend would sit beside him in silence, her hand linked with his, her presence a lantern against the shadows. She did not tell him he was strong, did not try to explain away the ache. She only reminded him without words that being accompanied was itself a form of survival. Once, as they sat together under a silver moon, he asked her, "Do you think we'll ever understand it all, the voices, the mysteries, the reasons?" She was quiet for a long time, then shook her head. "I don't think it's meant to be understood."
Only carried. Her words sank into him like rain into thirsty soil.
For the first time he felt no resistance to the mystery. Instead, he allowed it to be vast, ungraspable, like the stars themselves, and so he carried on. The garden he had tended began to bloom in colors more vivid than he imagined. The old man at the tavern one day lifted his eyes and whispered thanks, his voice trembling. The child with the flower began leaving small drawings at his door, tiny sketches of suns and trees, as if offering her own form of whisper back to him. Each act circled, rippled, returned. He began to see that kindness was not an arrow, but a circle, always finding its way back in forms unexpected. The call that had once frightened him became a rhythm in which he walked. He did not need to chase it, for it moved with him, always. And when he lay down at night, he no longer feared the whispers would vanish or turn harsh again. He knew now they were not here to command, but to accompany. They had been with his mother, they would be with him, and someday they would linger in the songs and gestures of those who came after. On the edge of sleep, he whispered aloud, not to his friend, not even to the stars, but to the unseen presence itself. I will keep singing,
even if my song is small. And in reply came not words, but a deep quiet,
filled with love so steady it felt eternal. The first night it changed, he almost thought it was his imagination. The whispers, once so soft and lulling, carried a new tone. They no longer floated like gentle currents through his dreams. Instead, they pressed closer, their edges sharper, their cadence slower, as if they were gathering themselves into something that could not be ignored. He stirred awake, the darkness heavy around him, and listened with his whole body. The sound was not frightening, but it had weight now, like a truth preparing to reveal itself. Preparing to reveal itself. He rose and walked outside, the grass cool beneath his feet, the air carrying the scent of rain though no storm had passed. The stars above shimmered more brightly than he remembered, as if every one of them leaned in to listen, and beneath their glow the whispers merged into a single pulsing rhythm. He could not yet hear the words, but he felt the call, a quiet summoning that stirred the marrow of his bones. In the morning, he told his friend. Her gaze lingered on him, tender and searching. "You've been waiting for this, haven't you?" she asked. He hesitated before answering, because though he had long felt it, he had not known how much it would change him to finally arrive at this threshold.
"I think so," he said.
"But I don't know what it means." She nodded slowly as though she too had been preparing, though in silence. "Whatever it is, you won't face it alone." Her words steadied him, yet he felt the path ahead, stretching like a river into unknown country. He spent the day in quiet tasks, mending, watering, sweeping, each movement a way of grounding himself in the ordinary. But beneath it all the call pulsed steadily, rising and falling like the tide. By evening he could no longer deny it. He felt compelled to return to the forest, to the stone that had once spoken in sound instead of words. They walked together this time. The trees opened their arms as if expecting them, branches swaying though no wind moved. The whispers guided them inward, clearer with each step. His friend held his hand, her presence reminding him that whatever waited would be softened by companionship. When they reached the clearing, the stone stood as before, weathered and eternal, yet different somehow, its surface faintly glowing in the dim light, as though it had absorbed centuries of starlight only to release it now. He approached slowly, the whispers swelling until they filled every breath. He placed his hand upon the stone, and again silence fell, but only for a heartbeat. Then came words, not in language he had ever studied, but in meaning so clear it bypassed thought. "You are not here by chance. You carry what has been carried before. You are part of what endures." His knees buckled, and he knelt before the stone. The voice was not loud, but it moved through him like a tide, carrying memory older than his own life. Images flickered behind his closed eyes, faces he had never seen, hands planting seeds, voices singing lullabies under the same stars. A thread stretched through them all, binding him to something larger, something endless. His friend knelt beside him, her hand steady against his shoulder. Though she did not hear the words, she felt their weight through him.
"What do they ask of you?"
She whispered. He shook his head, tears streaking down his cheeks. Not to do, just to be. To keep weaving what was begun long before me, and in that moment he understood. The whispers were not a command but a reminder. They did not demand grand actions, nor did they offer answers to every question. They called him simply to continue, to live with the same quiet tenderness, to carry memory into gestures, to pass forward what had been passed into him. The stone pulsed once more, a final echo of recognition before the light faded. The forest fell back into its natural hush, leaves whispering in a gentler way. He rose slowly, leaning into his friend's steadiness. Together they left the clearing, though he felt it would never truly leave him. The following days unfolded like threads pulled from a loom. He moved through them differently now, aware of the lineage of kindness behind every act. When he placed water by the tavern steps, he felt the memory of others who had carried pitchers through deserts. When he hummed his mother's forgotten melody, he felt the voices of countless lullabies rising beside his own. Even the smallest smile he offered seemed to ripple outward in ways he could not see but trusted, and the whispers did not vanish. They no longer pressed with urgency but walked beside him, a constant presence. Sometimes they spoke in words, sometimes only in tones, but always they reminded him, "You are part of the long song. Keep singing." There were nights he doubted again, nights when the weight of loneliness returned, and the absence of his mother ached too deeply. On those nights, his friend would sit beside him in silence, her hand linked with his, her presence a lantern against the shadows. She did not tell him he was strong, did not try to explain away the ache. She only reminded him, without words, that being accompanied was itself a form of survival. Once, as they sat together under a silver moon, he asked her, "Do you think we'll ever understand it all, the voices, the mysteries, the reasons?" She was quiet for a long time, then shook her head. "I don't think it's meant to be understood."
Only carried. Her words sank into him like rain into thirsty soil.
For the first time, he felt no resistance to the mystery. Instead, he allowed it to be vast, ungraspable, like the stars themselves. And so he carried on. The garden he had tended began to bloom in colors more vivid than he imagined. The old man at the tavern one day lifted his eyes and whispered thanks, his voice trembling. The child with the flower began leaving small drawings at his door, tiny sketches of suns and trees, as if offering her own form of whisper back to him. Each act circled, rippled, returned. He began to see that kindness was not an arrow, but a circle, always finding its way back in forms unexpected. The call that had once frightened him became a rhythm in which he walked. He did not need to chase it, for it moved with him, always. And when he lay down at night, he no longer feared the whispers would vanish or turn harsh again. He knew now they were not here to command, but to accompany. They had been with his mother, they would be with him. And someday they would linger in the songs and gestures of those who came after. On the edge of sleep, he whispered aloud, not to his friend, not even to the stars, but to the unseen presence itself. "I will keep singing, even if my song is small." And in reply came not words, but a deep quiet, filled with love so steady it felt eternal. The days lengthened, and the air took on the scent of ripening fields, the hush of seasons turning. He felt it in his body before he noticed it in the land, that quiet sense that time was beginning to lean toward reflection, that each step forward also carried the weight of what was behind. The whispers still walked beside him, steady and unhurried, but they no longer pulled. They accompanied him like a friend at dusk, content to share silence rather than urge him onward. One afternoon, he stood by the river and watched the current move. The water glimmered in layered hues, gold and silver where the sun touched, shadowed green where the trees leaned close. He thought of how rivers never begin where we see them, never end where our eyes lose sight. They carry beginnings and endings folded into each other, never asking to be known completely. He realized his own life might be the same. His friend joined him at the bank, her hair catching the late light. She held 2 pieces of bread wrapped in cloth, handing one to him without words. They ate in silence, the crunch of crust blending with the low murmur of the water. At length she said, "Have you thought about what you'll leave behind?" The question startled him, though not because it hadn't lived in his chest already. He had thought of it many nights, lying awake under stars that seemed to stretch further than his own span of days.
"Sometimes," he answered softly.
"I don't think it will be much. Small things.
A mended fence,
A song no one remembers who taught me. A kindness that might already be forgotten." She turned to him with quiet insistence in her eyes. "Those aren't small things.
they're threads."
Threads that hold everything together." Her words sank into him like seeds finding soil. He thought of the garden he had tended, of the child with the wildflower, of the old man's whispered thanks. None of those had felt monumental at the time, yet perhaps legacy wasn't built in monuments. Perhaps it lived in the unseen roots that allowed others to grow. Unseen roots that allowed others to grow. That evening, as he walked through town, he noticed faces in a new way. People he had once thought distant now nodded at him with softened expressions. A woman paused in her sweeping to smile, as if her day was lighter because he had passed. The child who left drawings at his door had drawn another, this time of a star cradled in a hand. He pinned it to the wall, feeling it speak more truth than words could. In the stillness of night, he thought of his mother again. Her absence no longer carved sharp lines in him, but it remained gentle and steady as the moon's pull on the tides. He imagined her watching, perhaps not with eyes, but with the same whispers that had guided him. He wondered if his own gestures would someday move through someone else the way hers had through him. The thought comforted him that we never truly end, only change shape in the way we're remembered, in the way we've touched the world. The whispers, as though hearing his thoughts, rose around him, not in command, but in a soft echo. You are remembered in every hand you've held. You are remembered in every breath you've steadied. You are remembered in ways you will never see. He closed his eyes, letting tears fall freely. There was no sadness in them, only the relief of knowing he didn't need to measure his worth by scale. It was enough to live gently, to love quietly, to leave the world softer than he had found it. The next morning, he and his friend returned to the hill where they had so often sat. The grass was tall now, brushing against their arms as they lay side by side, watching clouds drift like slow ships. "Do you ever wish for more?" he asked, suddenly surprising himself. She was quiet for a long while before answering.
"Sometimes.
But then I realize more isn't always bigger. Sometimes it's just deeper."
More isn't about how far we reach. It's about how deeply we've been felt." He let her words sink in.
He thought of how deeply he had felt her presence, how many times her silence had steadied him more than explanations could. If nothing else, he knew his life had been filled with her, and that was already more than enough. The season turned again. Leaves curled into fire-colored edges, air crisping with the promise of change. He sensed his story rounding into a circle, each day a quiet reflection of something he had already lived. But instead of fearing the cycle, he welcomed it. Life, like the river, like the whispers, was not about endings but about flow. One evening, the child who had left him drawings knocked softly at his door. She held out the dried flower he had given her long ago, now fragile and browned at the edges.
"I kept it," she whispered shyly, as though confessing a secret.
His heart swelled with something he could not name. He knelt and pressed the stem gently back into her hands. "And keep it still. It's yours more than mine now." When she left, skipping down the path, he realized this too was legacy. Not the flower itself, but the act of keeping it, the act of remembering. It lived because it had mattered, and because it had been carried forward. As nights grew longer, he felt the whispers weaving themselves into dreams again. But now they did not call him outward. They folded around him like a blanket, as though preparing him for rest. They carried no mystery he needed to solve, no secret he needed to uncover. They carried only the steady truth that being was enough, that loving was enough, that even the smallest gestures lived on beyond their moment. On the last evening of that turning season, he and his friend climbed the hill one more time. Stars scattered across the sky in their endless expanse. He lay back in the grass, the earth firm beneath him, her hand warm in his. For a long while they said nothing. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "Maybe legacy isn't what we leave. Maybe it's how gently we've touched what was never ours to keep." Her fingers tightened around his, her voice quiet but certain. "Then yours is already written." And in that stillness beneath the watchful stars, he believed her. The whispers did not contradict. They only hummed softly in agreement, like a lullaby sung through time itself. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, and felt the world exhale with him. The nights grew heavier with silence, yet it was a silence he welcomed, like a trusted companion who needed no explanation. Each breath seemed to carry a memory, and each step felt slower, more deliberate, as if the earth itself wanted him to linger a little longer. The whispers no longer hovered at the edges of his hearing, but settled deep inside, so that when he spoke or thought, he was not certain whether the words belonged to him or to them. It did not matter anymore. They were the same voice now. He walked through the town one final time as autumn's chill tightened its grip. The marketplace, once loud with shouts and clatter, seemed softer, gentler, as though it too knew that his days of wandering among it were drawing to a close. Children ran past him, their laughter crisp against the cool air. He smiled, though he knew they would not remember him in the years ahead. Yet he found comfort in that. For memory was not the only form of presence. Some people lived in echoes, carried forward in gestures too subtle to be traced back. He had come to understand that this, too, was enough. At the edge of the river he paused, watching the water darken under the dimming sky. He thought of all the times he had stood there, searching for direction, listening for whispers that called him toward some hidden horizon. Now he realized the river had never been pointing away. It had been teaching him to see the way things carried on, joined and departed, endless without needing to explain themselves. Perhaps life was not about following, but about flowing. His friend joined him, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She said nothing at first, only stood beside him, eyes fixed on the current. He could feel her unspoken worry in the way she shifted her weight, the way her fingers tapped against the fabric she held.
Finally, she asked, "Are you leaving?"
The question lingered in the cooling air. He did not answer at once, for he did not know what leaving meant anymore. The whispers had shown him that distance was not always measured in steps and presence was not always tethered by sight. After a long pause, he said, "In some ways, yes. But in others, I think I'll always be here." Her eyes glistened as she looked at him. "That sounds like something people say before they're gone." He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. Maybe. Or maybe it's what people say when they've realized they were never truly gone to begin with. That night, they returned to the hill where stars spilled endlessly above. The grass had turned brittle, whispering beneath their weight as they lay back together. He watched her face in the starlight, how the years had etched both strength and tenderness into her features. He wanted to tell her everything she had been to him, how she had steadied his wandering heart, how she had reminded him again and again that the simplest truths were the ones worth keeping. But words felt too small, and silence, once again, spoke more than language ever could. In the hush between them, he closed his eyes. The whispers rose like a tide within him, not sharp, not demanding, but steady as a heartbeat. You have walked well. You have loved gently. You have left the world softer than you found it. He felt no fear in their presence.
Only peace. The following days unfolded quietly, each moment stretched thin and delicate, like glass catching the light.
He moved slower through the streets, savoring every exchange, every smile, every unnoticed detail. The baker's flour-dusted hands, the blacksmith's rhythmic hammer, the child's chalk drawings on the stones. These things became treasures not because they were rare, but because he finally saw how fleeting they were. One morning, the child who always brought him drawings knocked again, this time holding a folded paper star.
"It's for you," she said, eyes wide with hope.
He unfolded it carefully, the creases crooked, the lines uneven, yet it shone to him like a constellation of its own. He placed it gently on the table, promising it would never be lost. When she ran away laughing, he whispered to the empty air, "I will not be forgotten, not because my name is remembered, but because this star was given." The days grew shorter, the nights longer. His body began to tire more quickly, and he found himself resting often on the bench beneath the old tree. He welcomed the slowing, the way the world seemed to move around him rather than with him. There was no bitterness in it, only gratitude that he had been part of its turning at all. On one of his final evenings, he walked once more to the hill. His friend was waiting, a lantern in her hand, its glow a small sun against the darkness. They sat side by side, the lantern between them, as though guarding a final fire. She spoke softly, almost as if afraid the night would swallow her words. "What will I do when you're gone?" Words. "What will I do when you're gone?" He looked at her, his gaze steady. "You'll do what you've always done. You'll keep living, keep loving, keep listening. And when the wind carries a whisper, you'll know it's me.
Not because I remain, but because love doesn't end.
It only changes its shape." She pressed her forehead against his shoulder, her tears warm against the cool air. He held her, not to erase her sorrow, but to remind her it was allowed. They stayed like that for a long while, until the lantern's flame flickered and finally went out. The darkness did not frighten them. It felt like a continuation, a widening of the sky. When he returned home that night, he did not light another candle. He lay down, the paper star still resting on his table, the whispers filling the room like a gentle tide. They did not call him away, nor did they keep him here. They only rocked him between worlds, steady and sure. His last thought before sleep was not of fear, but of gratitude, that he had walked through seasons, touched hands, left threads in the fabric of lives. And when morning came, the house was quiet. The chair by the window sat empty, the blanket folded neatly on its edge. His friend entered softly, her steps hesitant, but when she saw him, she did not cry. She only placed the paper star on his chest and whispered, "You were right. You'll always be here." The town remembered him in small ways, in the child who carried the memory of a flower, in the woman who still hummed the tune he once sang, in the way his friend lifted her eyes to the hill at night, certain she heard his laughter carried on the wind. He did not live on in monuments or in tales shouted loud, but in threads, quiet, unseen, unbreakable. The river kept flowing. The stars kept turning. The whispers, though no longer heard as before, lingered in the spaces between breaths, reminding anyone who listened that every life, no matter how ordinary, leaves a softness behind, and in that softness he remained, not gone, not waiting, simply part of the endless flow. The days that followed felt like the last pages of a book slowly turning, each one filled with more space than words, more silence than sound. He no longer sought the meaning of his journey, no longer searched for answers in the whispers of dreams or the shifting of stars. Instead, he allowed himself to rest in what had been lived, to breathe in the gentle truth that everything he needed had already passed through him, and that it would continue to live in others. Legacy was not a grand banner raised high, but a faint perfume left in a room long after its visitor had gone. When the first snow arrived, he sat at his window and watched the flakes drift down, soft as the hush of a lullaby. They gathered on rooftops, clung to branches, and rested on the river's dark surface before vanishing into it. He thought of his own life that way, moments falling one by one, touching the world, disappearing into its flow, yet never ceasing to be part of the whole. He felt no sorrow in this, only wonder at how something so brief could still be so beautiful. His friend visited often now, sometimes with food, sometimes with silence, always with presence. They spoke less than they used to, but it was a silence of fullness, not of emptiness. Once, as they shared a simple meal, she set her hand gently on his and said, "You've given more than you know." He smiled faintly, eyes drifting to the window where snow was thickening against the glass. "And you've received more than I deserved to give." They both laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was soft and true. The paper star still rested on the table beside him, its creases growing worn with time. He had begun to see it as more than a gift from a child. It was a symbol of the way small hands, small voices, small acts held the same power as great deeds, perhaps even greater. He often wondered if the child remembered giving it to him, or if she had already moved on to new drawings and brighter creations. It didn't matter. The star had already done its work. It had taught him that legacy was not only what you passed forward, but also what you accepted with gratitude. At night, he returned often to the hill where the sky stretched wide and unbroken. The stars, cold and countless, seemed to lean closer now, as if welcoming him into their chorus. He would lie back, feeling the frost beneath him, and let their silent music wash over his weary body. Sometimes he whispered into the sky, not asking for answers, but offering thanks. Thanks for the voices that had guided him. Thanks for the friends who had carried him. Thanks for the mysteries that had never fully unraveled, but had still made him whole. One evening, his friend joined him with a lantern, as she so often did. She set it between them, its flame flickering against the night wind. "Do you ever wish it had been different?" she asked quietly. He thought for a long moment before answering. "Once I did. I wished for clarity, for certainty, for a story written in simple lines. But now I think the beauty was in the questions, not the answers. The not knowing made me gentler. The longing made me kinder. And the waiting taught me patience." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'll carry those lessons too." The river, steady as always, continued its endless journey past the town. He visited it one last time, dipping his hand into the icy current. The water pressed against his skin, flowing past without resistance, carrying him into its rhythm. He closed his eyes and imagined himself as part of it, one drop among countless others, indistinguishable yet necessary. That thought brought him peace. To be part of something unending without needing to be noticed, that was enough. The townsfolk still passed him with nods and smiles, though some had begun to sense the quiet change in him. There was no sadness in their glances, only a respectful softness, as if they too understood that he was nearing a different kind of journey. The children no longer brought him flowers or drawings, yet their laughter still reached him, echoing down the alleys, filling his heart with echoes of earlier days. He realized then that legacy was not about being remembered in every detail. It was about having added one more note to the song of the world, a note that would keep playing even when its source was gone. As winter deepened, his body grew weaker. The walks became shorter, the pauses longer. He no longer tried to push against this slowing. He embraced it, seeing it as part of the rhythm that carried all things towards stillness. In the evenings he sat with his friend, speaking less and less, until their companionship was made only of shared breath, shared warmth, and the faint crackle of a fire. She never asked for more words than he could give. She only stayed, her presence enough. One night, as snow pressed thick against the windows and the fire burned low, he turned to her and said softly, "When I am gone, don't look for me in grand places. Don't search the skies for signs or the ground for relics.
Look instead in the smallest things, in the way light touches the river, in the sound of a child's laughter, in the kindness of a stranger."
That's where I'll be. Her eyes shimmered as she nodded. "I'll know," she whispered. The next morning, she found him still sitting by the window, eyes closed, his hand resting lightly on the paper star. For a moment, she thought he was only asleep, but then she understood. Tears filled her eyes, yet she did not weep loudly. She only reached out, smoothing the lines of the star, and whispered, "You are still here." Just as you said, in the days that followed, the town moved on as towns always do. The river flowed, the snow fell, the market reopened with its usual bustle. But subtle changes remained. People spoke with a little more gentleness. Children shared their drawings with more pride. Friends lingered longer in conversation, holding silence as though it mattered as much as words. And every evening his friend carried a lantern to the hill, setting it down on the grass and watching the stars. The flame flickered in the dark, and in its glow she felt him still. His story had not ended with his final breath. It had only shifted, becoming part of the countless quiet legacies that weave through every life, unseen yet unbroken. His laughter was in the wind, his warmth in the lantern's glow, his presence in the kindnesses that rippled outward, reaching farther than he could ever know. And as the snow fell heavier, covering footprints and rooftops alike, the world seemed to sigh with him, not in farewell, but in continuation, for nothing was truly lost. Everything had only changed its shape. The hill was quiet again, the lantern long since extinguished, yet the memory of its glow seemed to linger in the grass, as though the earth itself had taken on the duty of remembering. His friend came often still, carrying no flame now, for she had come to realize that the stars themselves were enough light. She would sit with her knees drawn close, listening to the night, feeling the wind brush against her as if it were his hand. She did not call it grief anymore. She called it presence, carried differently but still carried. She had learned to hear him in the ordinary, in the sound of the river folding endlessly over itself, in the hush of snow drifting across rooftops, in the laughter of children chasing each other through the narrow streets. These were the echoes he had promised would remain, and she found comfort in discovering them again and again. What once felt like loss now felt like continuation, a widening of the story rather than its closing. The paper star never left her home. She placed it on a small shelf above her bed, where the first light of dawn could touch it each morning. Sometimes she traced its edges with her finger, remembering his voice, the way he had called it more than just a gift, the way he had treated it like a constellation all its own. She smiled each time she saw it, for it reminded her that legacy was not bound to grandeur. It lived in paper and laughter, in small offerings that grew into symbols of infinite worth. The townsfolk, too, carried pieces of him without always realizing. The baker, who now placed an extra loaf aside for the child who lingered by the door. The blacksmith, who found himself humming while he worked, echoing a tune he could not recall where he had learned. The child who had once brought him flowers now grew taller, but still paused by the river each morning, staring into the current as though listening for something only she could hear. No one called it his influence, yet it was there, stitched invisibly into their daily rhythms. Seasons turned. The snow gave way to spring, blossoms crowding the edges of the river, filling the air with gentle fragrance. His friend walked among them, her heart no longer heavy but spacious, able to hold both the ache of missing and the sweetness of remembering. She thought often of his words, that love does not end, it only changes shape. She began to see this truth not only in memory but in every cycle of the world. Flowers wilted, yet their seeds endured. The river lost snowmelt but gained rain. The stars disappeared at dawn, only to return in evening. Love, too, transformed but did not vanish. One evening, as the sun set in a wash of lavender and rose, she gathered with others on the hill. They did not speak of him directly, but their closeness carried his presence. They shared bread, told stories, watched the first stars blink awake. The children ran in circles, laughter trailing like ribbons through the air. And when the lantern was lit, not out of necessity but tradition, they all watched its flames steady against the night. She knew he would have smiled at that, knowing he had become part of a ritual that asked for no explanation. The dreams did not end. Sometimes she dreamed of him standing by the river, his reflection mingled with the current. He did not speak in these dreams, but his gaze was steady, peaceful, reassuring. She would wake with tears on her cheeks, yet not tears of sorrow. They were the kind that came when the heart was stretched wide enough to hold both longing and gratitude. She began to treasure those dreams, not as reminders of absence, but as proof of a bond too deep to be broken by distance. As the years passed, the town changed. New faces appeared, new voices filled the market, new songs carried through the streets. Yet the hill remained, the river flowed, and the stars continued their watch. Those who had known him aged, their memories softening at the edges like old parchment, yet still vivid in the places that mattered. His name was spoken less often, but his presence endured in quieter ways, in the way kindness lingered, in the way silence was honored, in the way small things were given great meaning. His friend, older now, continued her evening walks to the hill. Her steps slowed with time, but her resolve never faltered. Each night she looked upward, whispering not with expectation, but with gratitude. She knew she was nearing her own horizon, yet she felt no fear. If the whispers came for her, they would be familiar, the same voices that had carried him gently. She would walk toward them willingly, knowing she too would become part of the endless flow. One particularly clear night, she lay back on the grass, the stars crowding overhead in countless numbers. She remembered his words from long ago, that he would not be found in grand places, but in the smallest things. She closed her eyes, listening to the night, and smiled.
"You were right," she murmured.
"You're here in everything." The wind moved softly across the hill, and she felt as though the earth itself agreed. The lantern at her side flickered, then steadied, its glow wrapping her in warmth. She thought of all the nights she had carried it here, all the evenings she had waited with patience and love, and she realized the lantern had become a symbol too, not of loss, but of continuity. The flame was small but steady, just like him, just like love, just like legacy itself. Her breath slowed, her body sinking deeper into the earth's embrace. She knew her time was near, yet she welcomed it. For she had come to see that endings were not walls, but doorways. Somewhere beyond the stars, or perhaps within them, he was still humming that quiet tune, still leaving threads of softness in the world. And soon she would join him, not to vanish, but to change her own shape, to become another note in the song that never ceased. The lantern burned low. The stars shone endlessly. The whispers stirred gently in the air, like the first lines of a lullaby. And in that moment she understood. He was not only still here, she was too. They both were together, in the endless weaving of love that spanned beyond time, beyond memory, beyond all boundaries. And so the story rested, not in a conclusion, but in a widening silence, in a breath that carried both the past and the future. For nothing is lost, everything flows, and somewhere, in the quiet between stars and rivers, laughter and whispers, he is still humming, and she is still listening. And now let the story drift away like a star fading at dawn. What lingers is yours to keep, the warmth, the softness, the reminder that love never ends. It only changes shape. Breathe deeply, rest fully. The night is kind, and so are you. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well.
Everything's gonna be okay, man. Everything's gonna be okay, man.